This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. We're here with the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Bogner, editorial director and co-founder of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Our guest today is Adam from Reuben's Brews in Seattle, Washington. Multiple winner of GABF Gold Medal for their Goza. We're here at the Great American Beer Festival 2017, and you've got great hopes coming up for a three-peat in the Goza category.
Well, it's like poker. You put a hand in and keep your fingers crossed, but you can never... There's a lot of luck as well, I think.
Sure. So what brought you to... you've certainly found some success with the Goza style. What led you to even brew the beer?
So we go back to we're 5 years old now, and we go back to our third anniversary. It was a beer we brewed specifically for our third anniversary initially. That was the first ever batch we did. And it was just a challenge, honestly. So the first three batches I did at home. So I was working out how to do a lacto ferment. We'll call it kettle sours, but like for me it was, is it in a pot? Is it in a keg?
Sure.
The home brew level, but like just trying to figure out a way of keeping the oxygen levels as low as possible to get nice clean sourness. First two were not good, so the cling film method does not work.
What'd you do wrong?
Well, I tried that cling film method, so where you put like cling film over the top, and that doesn't work at all. And then the second time I tried to just regularly purge my homebrew kettle. That doesn't work. So on the third one, I soured in one of my corny kegs. And then you can purge the living daylights out of it, there's no oxygen in there. And then that sort of, that's a 5-gallon batch, and then I scaled it up to a 7-barrel, so it's like a 30 to 40 time increase. But it is enough. The process is the same.
Yeah,
it's just a little bit technically different.
How do you hold temperature on a 5-gallon corny keg?
I had a, like you can get for big coolers where you convert a freezer into a cooler.
Sure.
So I have a temperature node that will click on and click off.
Yeah.
And then a heating wrap.
Okay.
So it was actually pretty easy. It's a lot easier to keep it at a certain temperature and then wrap it with tons of towels and other things. But it's a lot easier to do that than to keep temperature in the 7-barrel system, because you're just relying on thermal mass.
Right.
You're going to pitch in a certain temperature and you're going to be dropping down.
Sure.
And you don't want to turn the burner on because you get stratification and all.
Right. Did you, how did you choose a lactobacillus strain for this?
I wanted one that is a pure acidifier, not a attenuator, because you don't want to create any alcohol in the kettle, and obviously when you heat up alcohol you can get some explosions. So I want a nice clean one, and so 5335 Y yeast is what I used, and going back, so what I did is I proved to myself at home how I could brew one, and then use that as a propagator for the commercial batch. So, a 5-gallon batch, if you get a 5-gallon propagation from Y yeast or something like that, it's like a couple of $1,000.
Yeah.
Whereas you can get, a little vial, spend a day or two, and save yourself the vast majority of that, and prove to yourself that you're doing the process right as well. Before you waste 190 gallons.
Right.
Yeah.
So now you in the brew house, how did you scale that up? And you use a separate tank now, or do you?
No, it uses up the kettle for a couple of days.
Couple of days.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because we one thing I did coming from a home brewer to a commercial brewer, like I was trying to know what I didn't know.
Right.
And one thing I wanted to focus on is consistency, and I think that's one thing that's got us to where we are. Is even when we were just brewing 10-barrel batches, we're very consistent with them.
Right.
And one of the ways that we did that, we double batched in every fermenter.
Yeah.
So if the first batch came in, the gravity slightly high, or the mash temp was slightly off, we can adjust for that in the second batch.
Sure.
And we've taken that philosophy all the way through. So now we do between 2 to 4 batches, depending on what the beer is into a fermenter. And even with the kettle sours, we'll do 2 batches in, so we can adjust appropriately.
Yeah.
Keep it more consistent.
It sounds like a lot to, given the time that it takes to acidify.
Well, so what we found is it's a very reliant based on pitch rate. So we're putting into like 22 barrels now, I think 3 or 4 corny keg equivalents. And if you half that down, you're going to double the length of time it takes to acidify.
Okay.
The lacto, when you're pitching it, if that's at an ambient temperature close to what it's going to go into, it's a lot happier.
Yeah.
You can shock it quite extremely if
Sure.
you're going to go in from cold, from 38 degrees going into 110, it shocks it, and that takes a lot longer. So we can now get from like 4.5 pH down to about 3.3 in 12 to 16 hours. And that's from healthy bacteria.
Right.
And we're still running off of that original batch that I brewed at the brewery, which was the first batch we ever brewed, and that was the first one gold at GABF. So it's like, yeah, I don't want to change
quite
that.
A pedigree to that lactobacillus strain.
Yeah.
So I just, you mentioned pH. Do you measure pH and TA? I imagine in the beer, and you say 3.3 is your goal pH. That's a rather hefty acidity for a Goza. Why targeted there?
TA gets to between like 7.5 to 8. Why target
That's
there?
interesting because that's for a 3.3 pH, but only a 7 to 8 TA. There's a bit of a discrepancy there.
It's just the way it's
No. I think
it's,
that's the question. Of course, everyone in the world of sour, tart, and and whatnot beer is facing is that those things don't correlate necessarily in that one-to-one manner. And given the type of acid and that they're creating, they're perceived as different ways, and that pH is not necessarily a perfect measure of the sensory perception of the level of acidity in that beer. And so 7 to 8 is kind of midline for a sour beer, and we've seen plenty in the 14, 15, 18 range. Hopefully you have some residual sugar left in the beer to kind of soften that a little bit if you go to that kind of level. But 7 to 8 is fairly moderate. I know a lot of Berliner Weisses on the very light side, getting that 4 and 5 TA range. But why 7 to 8 for the Goza?
It's goes back to balance, right? So there's a lot of science in brewing, but I think I see science as guardrails. So if you do this, it's not going to work. That's the science side of it. But where the real fun and the focus for us is in the art. So by that balance, so I see sour beers similar to like the IBU wars of 5-10 years ago, where 100 plus IBUs was where it was at. Right. That didn't taste good to me then, but it was on a roll, right? And some, like in sour beers, you need that balance.
Right.
So we keep the terminal gravity relatively high for the Goza, like 2 Plato.
Yeah.
So it's not too dry.
Yeah.
And then that will offset the pH position and salinity as well. You got to remember, like when you're adding salinity into any beer, we use certain like we add baking soda into our darker beers to play with the pH, but also that gives a little bit more body into the beer, which is what you want for a darker beer. What you got to remember when you're adding the extent of salinity into the Goza, you're going to add body in as well. So you got to factor all of these sort of more sensory elements into the recipe.
And so you say, so how, is there a specific type of salt that you found that you use for your goza? You are at a coastal spot there in Seattle. So
well, we go a few thousand miles the other way, Fleur de Sel. So we
okay.
I just think that's got a effervescence, a vibrancy that is it just adds a something extra that that sort of all adds up. Same with coriander. So when we first did our first batch, I would go into the local organic store and they have all the different pots of coriander, and I would actually smell each one because they oxidize pretty quickly and then get that really musty.
Right.
So you lose the lemonness, if that's a word. So what we do now is we actually grind the coriander during the boil, so there's no risk of oxidization.
Right.
Same with every beer that we use.
It's a really interesting point, and I think it's something that I'm hearing more brewers talk about, that treating a lot of their spicing in the same way that folks think about coffee, that the more fresh that you get that grind, then the higher the quality, less oxidation, and the more vibrancy of that spice flavor. But that's an interesting point. While you're boiling, you grind your coriander.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the little grinder we got doesn't like it very much.
No.
It's overworked. But
no, that's fantastic. And so you hold for 12 to 18 hours with your lacto at you mentioned 110 degrees.
Yeah.
That's your magic temperature.
Yeah, within a couple of degrees of that.
Sure.
Yeah.
I hear the range for most, I think, is in that 100 to 120 range, and everyone has their own special spot where they like to keep it. But.
Yeah, there might be I was gonna say selection bias, but that's not the right word. But like the thermal mass of the kettle could impact that. Also, where you're selecting, your temperature from could impact that. Like, we don't trust any of our vessels have a thermometer in them, but they're always at the side, right?
Yeah.
So it's always going to be cooler there than it actually really is in the middle. So
makes sense.
Yeah.
So in addition to the goes, you mentioned before we started talking that you've just recently launched a new Pilsner.
Yeah.
It's an interesting move, and we're seeing lots and lots of craft brewers start taking forays into, for a long time, craft beer couldn't get itself any further away from the Pilsner style, given its historical connection to some of the world's biggest brewers. But what led you to jump into that style, and one that's notoriously difficult to brew incredibly cleanly and crisply?
Yeah. So, at our tap room, we have 25 different beers on tap. We actually have technically two breweries. We have a production brewery and a smaller 5-barrel system, our original, so we can brew multiple different styles. And on those 25 different beers, we want people to have enough options when they come in. So there's something light, something dark, something malty, and something hoppy, right? And sour now. So there's actually really 5 different categories. So we've always had in our head, from a portfolio perspective in the tap room, we want to offer all of these different beers. So our distribution option shouldn't be any different, right? So
right.
I would like it if we could go into a bar or any account and say, are you looking for any style, and have that available. Because I think there's a lot of strength in diversity from a brewery's perspective. Mm-hmm. Also, we can keep our just in terms of keeping our own sanity, right? We don't want to just become an IPA shop. We also want to be able to brew lots of different things, and keeps the team focused. And I think in our first year we brewed 70 different beer styles.
Wow!
I've lost count since then how many we've done, but yeah, Czech style Pilsner was one that we found was very popular in the tap room. So it's like a good sort of sounding board. Does this work? And like you said about it's a difficult style to brew. So it's part of the reason why we did the Goza was the challenge. Right, we'd never done any kettle souring before, and at Pilsner, I'm moving more into lagers. I think the industry is moving more into that way. I think Pilsner's in a nice spot because it's a good entry into craft, and it's a good spot to be in as well if you're coming out of the IPA hiatus, right?
Right.
So I think you've got a nice junction of where drinkers are coming from or going to.
You're right. There's still quite a bit of hoppiness in Pilsners, even though it may not be the first thing that some people think of in those beers. But
it's a nice coming down from if you don't want
Right.
the 100 IBU triple IPA.
Sure.
Yeah, and
Some of these pilsners have more bittering additions on the hot side than a fair number of IPAs these days.
yeah, because we get a lot of isomerization from whirlpool additions.
Yeah,
So oftentimes with our IPAs, we are bittering really low amounts,
Right.
knowing we're going to pick up
sure.
like 40, 50 IBUs from a whirlpool.
Interesting.
Yeah, so you're totally true. We do bitter a lot more in terms of pounds of hops with the Pilsner than we do our IPA.
Sure.
Even though the IPA is about 50% more IBUs.
We'll come back and talk to you about whirlpool isomerization later in a little bit here.
Yeah,
But so Pilsner, do you have you invested in horizontal tanks? What kind of turn time do you get on this? I know it's notoriously a slow beer
Yeah.
for most brewers, given the extensive lagering times, but it's also a beer that brewers themselves tend to be more passionate about than a lot of other beers. We were at Bierstadt Lagerhaus last night, and it was a virtual who's who of the brewing world as everyone sat down to drink their Pilsner. And I think that speaks to just how much brewers themselves really love the style. But it does generally involve a significant investment on the brew house side, to make that beer.
We had to buy plate and frame filters, and so we got two. We got a pretty big one and a smaller one for the two different breweries. We don't have horizontal tanks. From our sensory analysis, we find our fermentation in all beers, we wait until terminal has been reached, then we give it 2 days, and then we start doing VDK testing.
Yeah.
And only when it's past VDK do we often put into a soft crash to harvest yeast from. And what we found with Pilsner, if 2.5 to 3 weeks after VDK passing, that's when it rounds out. And that, to me, is the impact of the lagering process, right? So it's a little rough up to that point, and then at that point, and it's very consistent, weirdly so. And so it's not. We don't think from the time of the brew day. It's from when the yeast has essentially done its job and cleared itself up, which often varies by 2 to 3 days, depending on the strain, depending on
Right.
How many generations it is, or how long it was off a beer before, or so that means we're looking at 4.5 to 5 week turn for it to round out nicely. We use predominantly German Pilsner malt. It's a Czech style, so we use Czech Saaz hops, the terroir in hops. There's a massive difference between Saaz and a noble, in inverted commas, US grown hop, and this beer really shows it out because there's nothing to hide behind. Right?
Yeah. What are some of the sensory differences that you get from this?
Oh, this is more with US grown hops. You always have that little citrus in the background. It's almost in everything.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Even if it was a derivative.
Or now, when
noble.
you say that, are you getting that in a blind sense, or is there some attachment where if you're smelling or tasting both of those?
In a blind sense. Normally,
Okay,
if I'm
yeah.
trying somebody else's Pilsner lager,
Yeah.
you can tell pretty immediately
Yeah.
the terroir of the hops that they used. Right? And I think the spiciness goes really well with the breadiness of the malt and this style. We keep minerality really low.
Yeah.
I don't like, similar to IPAs, I don't like when you have that sort of gypsum-fied sort of bite at the end. You want it to be
Right.
soft and balanced. Same thing in Pilsners. That's why we've gone more of a Czech style, and that's selfish on my part, right? Because I far prefer it when it's rounded and balanced. There's a little minerality, but really, really pretty low in this version.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeast strain and approach on that?
Yeah, we use the same yeast in all our lagers. Can't remember the Y yeast number now. I could find it out pretty quickly. But it's the one that's very versatile. So you can brew steam beers with it.
Oh.
You can so it has a pretty wide tolerance between. We take it for our Mexican lager down to 50, really nice and crisp, and and this beer is at 52 when we ferment it at.
Yeah.
If you go up to 54, you start getting too much of an ester profile.
Okay.
So it's pretty sensitive.
Huh.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you mentioned IPAs earlier and whirlpool isomerization. It's hard to be a craft brewer today and not make IPAs.
Yeah.
Certainly in the Pacific Northwest where you are, there's a high demand, for IPAs, and a relatively specific subset of that kind of West Coast style that tends a little more towards the dank and resinous. Where do you pin your IPAs, or do you play across the field on those?
Yeah, we do play across the field, so to speak. Crikey. So, little story. We didn't brew a standard American IPA for the first 2 years that we were open, because we had 12 taps and we only had a 5-barrel brew house. We did imperial IPAs and triple IPAs, but we didn't do a standard IPA because I was scared of that becoming 70% of what we made.
Yeah.
And when we got to expanding and making an IPA, the person who designs our labels, she said, I've got to come up with a name now for this beer, because we'd only ever called beers by the style. And my wife and I spent a night thinking about it, and then we went for the Britishisms, because I was born in the UK, obviously. So Crikey is our first IPA, and that's about 40% of what we brew as a brewery. That's more along the West Coast style, very like clear, uses Amaryllis and Citra, so it brings fruitiness in, but still has a citrus sort of base. Pretty rounded bitterness. We aim for like 53 IBUs, so it's not too much bitterness. We have also recently been working on a crush series, so it's every month we release a new hazy IPA.
Oh.
So playing with like London 3. Which is a lot of fun.
So hot right now.
Yeah, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I mean, it totally takes things in a different way, I think.
So you don't fall into that purist line of thought that says we're never going to make it hazy. There's only West Coast style.
Well, hazy is a byproduct of something else you're trying to do. So if you're trying to make a beer really fruity and really taste really and have a really big nose, fruit-forward nose, well, you're going to use a very ester-driven yeast strain, which are these British strains that we use. You're going to use some of the New World hops, which have really high oil levels, that are more on the fruit-forward side. So those two together immediately is going to create a lot of polyphenol haze, right? From period, which means you can't bitter it that much,
right?
So then otherwise you're going to have a lot of yeast bite, so then you have to soften that down, and then how are you going to balance that hop profile with malt profile? Well, caramel doesn't really go very well with these big fruit-forward flavors, so that's where the oats come in. So people talk about hazy IPAs because it's an easy descriptor, but it's really starting from trying to be a very fruit-forward IPA, I think.
Right. Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting piece of this. They're much maligned, and there are certainly a number of folks that decry the style because they think it's full of yeast haze. And some of the brewers that I've been talking to lately they're actually pulling all of the yeast out of their hazy IPAs specifically because they will only stay hazy if they get all of that yeast out of the beer. The leaving more yeast into the beer actually decreases the haze and causes it to precipitate out when it's packaged. So I think that's an interesting and strange misconception on the part of a lot of folks about the style.
You get sure a lot of people have had this, but you get autolysis in a lot of these beers as well, where there's too much reliance on yeast to create that haze. That over time, obviously, you end up tasting stuff you don't want to taste in them. What we do is we've extended a rest time. So post dry hop, we give the beer up to a week just sitting in the tank, just to let everything drop out. We don't have a centrifuge, so it's sort of our equivalent at 33 degrees, letting it sit for a good amount of time, which is counterintuitive to trying to get the biggest nose that you want, right?
Right.
But we found that really does let it round out, and then the intensity of the dry hop as well is a bit green early on.
Right.
It lets it soften out as well and mellow. So just what we've found over time.
I couldn't agree with you more on that. That most of these beers with those incredibly dramatic, drastic dry hopping regimens come out, upon initial packaging or within a couple of days, tasting far too hot with that hops bite and burn.
Yeah.
That bit of that herbal burn, and there's a sweet spot usually 7 to 10 days after that where I can drink them and enjoy it, and I think where those hops pull together into what they're going to be in that beer.
Yeah.
And I hear that from a number of brewers that even they prefer those beers with a little bit of time after packaging.
Yeah.
That makes sense to do it in the tank. Well,
So.
even though it costs you more money in tank time while you let it sit there.
Yeah. It's kind of
I
like...
guess it's that or package it and leave it in a cold box for another 7 to 10 days, which would still take the same amount of time.
You'd still have... The beer would still be on yeast in that case, though.
Right.
And that's what kind of... it's kind of like having a best after date. Like we as a brewery don't want to do that ever.
Sure.
I don't want to sell you something and say, oh no, don't drink it for a week, because I wouldn't. It's like, that's not what we were about. Yeah.
No, that makes sense. I imagine you measure after the fact. You track how much yeast is left in those beers, and you find they clear up pretty well.
Yeah. I think we do. I think, like I said, with that amount of time, that's a lot of time really cold for it to drop bright. We should plate some of them just to see what the yeast count is. We haven't done that.
Mm-hmm.
We send all of our beers to a third-party lab. We have our own little lab, but we also outsource a lot of spectrophotometer work, etc.
Sure.
So we get actual VDK levels. And in these beers, I'm sure you've already heard that often you get secondary fermentations at dry hop.
Yeah.
So the issue with that is not so much the secondary fermentation, because you can monitor that. You've got to make sure that you don't get a diacetyl pickup as well.
Right.
Because you can get some VDK coming out of that. So we do an additional VDK test on that beer now after the dry hop, before we crash it, because we essentially dry hop warm.
Yeah.
Get far better extraction.
You mentioned isomerization in the whirlpool. What point do you pitch your whirlpool hops? Is there a certain temperature point that you reach, to shoot below that isomerization level? And when we say isomerization, is it actually measurable as isomerized alpha acids, or is that just a perception that you're getting from oxidized alpha acids or some other component that could be adding that perceived bitterness, even though it's not measurable in that pure IBU scale?
So if I'm looking at my brewing software and coming up with a recipe, the brewing software will give me, for something like crikey, like 17 IBUs. But it doesn't take into account correctly the whirlpool isomerization, which adds up to that 55 level. So when I'm actually working on recipes, I have to think about the knockout length. We don't generally drop the temperature of the whirlpool. It's something that we've got on our list of things to do, but then I'll have to take into account the impact of not having that isomerization as well.
Right.
But what we've been playing with is, I've got a good feeling now, a way of calculating out from any beer what our whirlpool addition it will be to what actual IBUs it does give. And then, but what I've been doing generally is I feel that the return, like the punch of flavor and aroma from a whirlpool addition is relatively minimal. So what I've been doing generally is taking out whirlpool additions and putting them into the dry hop. So our dry hops are getting a lot bigger, and our whirlpool's getting a lot relatively smaller. And that's a consistent thing over time. One thing we do is all beer is on a journey, and we're never there, so no recipe is ever locked. So every recipe is up for discussion at all times, and there'll be minor tweaks. There might be just process changes, like how we dry hop or something, but everything is always being looked at, and that's one thing that we've been doing over time, like moving the hops for a certain beer later and later.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. I think that's an interesting point that you make about continuously tweaking There are a number of breweries out there that don't do that and that lock in a recipe, and that's their recipe, and they have a brand standard for that and an expectation among consumers. But I do think that today we're starting to see craft beer consumers that have a different mindset around that and that have a relationship to that beer and that brand. I also see another interesting effect happening, and that's the context that we drink beer in is constantly changing.
Yep.
And so the way that you might perceive a brand like that from a brewery, the question exists is that brand the perception of the consumer based on where that general consumer is today? Do you need to move that beer and recipe forward with them? Or do you lock it in time, in which case that perception of your consumer, their perception of that beer may change over time simply because their context and their palate is changing. We hear it over and over again. That beer wasn't the same once they scaled it up and brewed it on this bigger system, and it was so much better a couple of years ago when I first had it. And I keep having to remind folks that that's not the only thing that's changed. The other thing that's changed is your palate has changed because you've had that many more inputs over the last 2 years, and now you drink this beer and it hits you differently because your palate has shifted and changed. What's your philosophy around that? I mean, I imagine if you're continuously tweaking those recipes, you're also able to kind of move it forward with your own palates and kind of dial it into your own perceptions, and those are going to be changing as well.
There's another reason why people lock in a recipe is you've got all these hop contracts behind it, right?
Sure.
And to me, if we ever get to a point where we can't change a recipe because we're locked in for any production reason, then we're too big. That's to me the definition of being too big, right?
Yeah.
We need to be able to be nimble and be able to change things if we think it will make the beer better. And that's our job, to make the beer better all the time. And like I said, they're very incremental steps, but over a number of years, it should help. For us, I think there's always every harvest is different. Every hop harvest is different.
Sure.
I was selecting in Yakima last week, or maybe even earlier this week. I've lost track of the days, right? But every time, like what we're seeing is different crops of different hops. Every year, the rhizomes are getting a year older, and they're slightly different. So nothing should really stay the same, like permanently. The industry is changing like a lot and really quickly. Like even in our short lifetime, we've gone through this Imperial Pale Ale obsession that was really brief. Remember that? Belgian IPAs.
Sure.
Like really big, but for like a really short period of time.
And no one makes them anymore.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. And then black IPAs as well was another one that was.
Yeah.
But I think what my main job at the brewery is to think about tomorrow and like where are trends going, because not every new trend is going to stick, but I think something like hazy IPA would stick, or maybe moving towards a more drinkable IPA. Mm-hmm. So taking that hop addition and moving it later, getting more flavor and aroma out. I think that is something that's a trend that we need to be relevant forever. We were in this for the long run, right? So we can't just say, right, this is the beer and this is the way it's going to be.
Right.
Because you're right, everybody's on their own journey, and you've got to try and feel where they're going. Otherwise, you become obsolete in their journey.
I think it's a positive thing for craft beer in general that we are focused on flavor now, and it's not simply that bitterness equation.
Yeah.
I think where we are today with craft beer is also a direct result of where the agriculture is. That 5 or 8 years ago, we certainly didn't have as wide access to a lot of these hops and the flavors they produce. We certainly didn't have widespread use of the techniques to maximize some of those flavors. And so that brewing technique and that advance in technique has kind of marched forward and in lockstep with these developments in agriculture and pushing forwards and and influencing each other. You all are in Seattle, and you're just over the mountains from Yakima, where 38,000 acres of American hops are grown. How is that proximity and with the access that affords you, impacted the way that you think about hops and the way that you build recipes around them?
we're very fortunate to be so close.
Sure,
That's the first thing. Like fresh hop.
You have some of the cheapest wet hop, fresh hop beers to make, since you can simply drive out there and drive back.
We do. Yeah, so we did 3 different wet hop beers this year, which is nice. One of the experimental farms, I was lucky enough a couple of years ago to walk through and rub a number of the new hops that are in development, and that only came about because we are literally 2-hour drive away.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing about that is, for me, that opened my mind as to some of these newer hops coming out. Like, there was one that was really very, very coconutty. One that was very, like, woody to the extent it was almost like a barrel.
Huh.
Right. So it's these new flavors and aromas that can come out of hops are far more broad than what we traditionally think about. So that was something that came specifically out of being so close. I think also it makes selection a lot easier. We have good relationships with farmers, so we get to understand their process, the impact of the microclimates in the different fields a lot more than you would otherwise. I totally understand the difference in selection. So where you can take a hop just based off of the microclimate it was in, or when it was picked in the harvest cycle, right?
Sure.
So, it maybe our learning curve was a bit quicker than it would have been if we were a few thousand miles away.
Right.
But I think most of the good brewers understand all of that anyway.
Right.
But we're fortunate because we are so close, and we can. There are some hops, and I didn't get a chance to do it this year, but like the proximity is very helpful. That they don't do selection for.
Mm-hmm.
So what I could do is when they're harvesting, I can go and actually rub the different lots that have been picked that day and pick the one that I want for that day. Right? Yeah. So that again, if you're not close,
right.
As luck would have it, I was out of town, so I was not close this year. but future years, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I was just up in Yakima at the first week of harvest this year, and got to watch all of that starting up, and it was a fascinating process for me to get up close with the farmers, and it is amazing the difference of the terroir, even within certain elements of the different valleys, and the lower valley and upper valley, and Toppenish versus Moxie, and quite a bit of difference just in the way that the vines were growing. It seemed like the lower valley this year had a little more robust growth than the Moxie and the upper valley area. But
and then it's just so exacerbated if you take that to the UK or Germany.
Yeah.
Like some hop varietals are being grown in multiple different countries.
Right.
And they'll be fundamentally different hops.
Yeah.
It really would be.
On that sense, the concept of talking about the terroir of those hops, or the farms where they're originating from, is something that I'm just seeing creeping into craft beer right now. There was a craft brewery up in New York that mentioned the farm that they obtained hops from for one of their new beers, and have you done anything like that, and really talked about where these hops are coming from and how that terroir impacts the flavor of the beer?
We haven't. No, we haven't done that specifically. We've in the Northwest. There's a big, as in a lot of the country. I see it a lot more around malt.
Yeah.
So locally grown, locally malted barley seems to be a lot more of a push rather than the hop profile. My thing is I want to use the I'm trying to come up with a recipe for what I want the beer to taste like in the glass, and how I want it to be in the glass, and I want to use any weapon at my disposal to make that as close to my goal as possible. If that means we can go local with something, then that's exactly what we'll do.
Right.
But German Pilsner malt, to me, there's no equivalent of, So we end up having in the brewery multiple different Pilsner malts, depending on the style that we want to brew. We might cut some Pilsner malt, German Pilsner malt with US Pilsner just to reduce that breadiness, to let some hops shine through it sometimes as well.
Right.
So we haven't done, we've done more like locally focused like ingredients around coffee actually.
Yeah.
Our local roaster that we work with, we've done some really good stuff with them, and they've been great to work with. They're maybe a mile away from the brewery, and
right.
They roast really light, so that fruit forward
Sure.
note works well in beer, you know. So that's where we've tended to focus on locally sourced ingredients so far.
Have you worked with any local craft maltsters? I'm not sure what exists for that up in your area.
So Skagit Valley Malt is one of I think the biggest one in the north, certainly in Washington State, and we've worked with them on one of our hazy IPAs. Actually.
Oh wow!
Because one of the tricks I think in that style is you've got a very you haven't got too much malt complexity in there, so you have to get that in certain ways. So like using a locally malted Pilsner malt, added a little bit of, I shouldn't say a little bit of something else into that beer that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Right.
It adds another layer of flavour in. Yeah, so we worked with them. That's relatively recently, just a couple of months ago.
Yeah. And any issues in dialing in recipes or their data and their malt profiles are pretty clear, and everything converts the way you expect it to. I know that's something that all the craft maltsters are really pushing for, to understand the diastatic power of those malts and make sure that they perform in a brew house the way that brewers expect them to.
Yeah, even with our larger suppliers, we get variability. Right?
Interesting.
So,
okay.
So it's, you have to. I think sometimes we as brewers forget this is a agricultural process.
Right.
And we sort of are thinking we're buying this and it will work every time. But we have to get the lot analysis, understand for each lot of malt, like, are there major differences that we need to account for on this lot? We've only used locally malted grain as a layering of flavor, not as the base. So I haven't gone all that far, but I think what we could do is use our smaller system to start testing that sort of stuff, like what efficiency we get, what protein is still comes through in the beer, and whether there's clarity issues. And I'm sure there's none of those problems, but I prefer to try it on a smaller batch before we scale, and understand the lab results that they can give us, that we can make sure that we can get consistency on an ongoing basis.
Right.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that part of your job is understanding where beer is going and where it's going to be in 6 months or in a few years, so that you can play that long game. Yeah. What are some of those trends that you see and that you're keeping an eye on, and that you're working towards as these things shift forward?
Well, it's no coincidence that we just launched our Pilsner in cans recently. I think that's definitely an area of growth for the industry. I think I honestly think the hazy IPA, in inverted commas, that is something here to stay. I think it adds something unique to beer that wasn't there before.
Right.
So I think that's definitely around. I think speaking to brewery out of the UK, they think that it's more than just Pilsner, it's more a movement towards different types of lager and lager-esque beers.
Right.
Which you can see that sprouting. I don't know if that will grab and really grow a lot.
Yeah.
But we've seen a deterioration of pumpkin beers, for example, right? But I think that's because that season has been overwhelmed. Well, overwhelmed might not be the right word, but sort of replaced with fresh hop beers. Yeah. And certainly in the Northwest. And also like Märzen or Fest beer.
Right.
So, which I wonder if that's part of that expanding of the lager sort of genre.
Right.
Is part of that. I think there's a growing attachment to understanding breweries, and so tap rooms are increasingly more popular. I think that can only continue. I think there's a more of a focus towards freshness, so people really understand how beers drop off over
Right.
time. Cans are great because you can get the DO level really low, lower than we can in a bottle.
Yeah.
And you got no, no. A lot. It's a far better container generally.
Right.
But we're seeing far better longevity of our IPAs.
What do you all
cans.
can on?
So we have a Wild Goose,
Okay.
250.
250.
Yeah. But what we're finding, even with that, we've Frankensteined it. Right?
Yeah.
So we've got all these pieces on that aren't out of the extra CO2 purging. And
Right.
We've taken parts of it off and changed them around to reduce the DO. So it's like even that is a work in progress, right?
What kind of DO levels do you get in your cans now?
So if we basically run it through the DO meter and just shaken. So I haven't calculated this back into total, but that's just a number that we can quickly do when we're running.
Right.
We can get down to like on the last run. The day I flew out here, I went and checked what we were doing, and we 4 fill heads. One was at 60, and the other 3 were at 40.
Oh.
Which is pretty low.
Those are really aggressive numbers
Yeah.
for a canner
Yeah.
on that kind of level.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a great team that is really
Sure.
focused on it, and again, it's similar with the beers, right? Everything is open and for discussion, and
Right.
we've spent a lot of time working on that and dialing it in, and some of the things are like counterintuitive. So to get a better DO level, you have to fill at slightly lower level than not that it's less than 12 ounces, but like if you might think that you want to fill to the brim,
Yeah.
right? And that will reduce the DO because there's no space for it.
Right.
But actually, what happens there is you can't fob out the remaining headspace as easy. So you really want to get. It's kind of weird, but you want to get a nice head that's really tight and thick. If it's too loose, there's too much oxygen in there. But if it's tight and thick, then it's normally full of CO2.
Yeah.
So it's a lot. It's kind of weird, but getting low DO levels in a canning line is all about the way that the head forms on the can before the lid goes on.
Interesting. Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought that, but yeah.
How'd you come to that? I mean, was there some trial and error? And
Speaking to lots of people in the community.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wild Goose are great to support
Yeah.
us as well, generally. And there's also variability between the different fill heads, so having
Sure.
to work out why that is. And
Right.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, so what are your big hopes for the Great American Beer Festival?
We're pouring 5 beers, I hope, and we're also at Paired this year actually, so that's going to be fun.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting. I've never done Paired before, so it'd be interesting to see how we do there. We got one of our hazy IPAs there actually. That's a Nelson Sauvignon hop forward IPA. So that will be fun to see. And then I liken the competition to like poker, right? So
Right.
you put a good hand in, but there's a lot of variability. And this year I think we have put a good hand in. We went through all of our beers that we submitted just before I left, and they're all strong. A couple are really strong. We got the 2 breweries, so we did a couple of pro-ams this year.
Yeah.
And the Washington Beer Awards, we won the gold medal with one of the pro-ams. It was a Saison that was really nice. And then we've also got an IPA that has worked out really well using YET, which is a hop that we hadn't used before. It's really quite hard to get in decent amount.
YET.
Yeah, YET, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, YET. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you prepare your entries in any special way? Is there? I know some breweries have a very elaborate system for bottling their samples that they send for the competition.
No, long purges.
Yeah.
Oxygen is the bane of our existence.
Yeah.
We what we do is we plan the brew schedule to try and align with the fresher, like the hoppier beers being ready the day that we have to ship them. We normally give ourselves a day or two wiggle room, but that's really the only thing we do.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is you're brewing a beer not to be tasted like when it's brewed. It's to be how does it taste in 6 weeks' time?
Yeah.
And that's the fundamental difference with all of this. That it takes a while to sort of figure out that.
Right.
Okay, so how do I brew a beer that tastes good in 6 weeks' time? Not necessarily straight away. It's
Right.
It's kind of an oxymoron almost, right?
Right.
You normally want to make a beer that tastes great straight away. Not
It's like Wayne Gretzky said, you're skating to where the puck's going to be instead of...
yeah.
Well, that's an interesting challenge. Well, best of luck with
Thank
the
you.
competition this year.
Thanks.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank
from
you.
Reuben's Brew,
Thank you for your
Seattle, Washington. Thanks for talking to us about brewing. You're in the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. Once again, host Jamie Bogner. If you want to read more, beerandbrewing.com is the website. Check us out on Instagram and Twitter at craftbeerbrew. And check out Reuben's Brews. And where can they find you, Adam?
Yeah, ReubensBrews.com.
ReubenBrews.com.
Yeah.
What states are you distributed to?
So we're Northwest, so Washington, Northern Idaho, and Northern Oregon, so the Portland area.
And if they're not distributed in your area, then find a friend in the area that can trade and ship you some. Thanks very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.